Good morning, everyone. It's good to be back with you again, although at the moment I record this, every resident in the Hermitage is free of COVID-19. No one has the virus now. So that's wonderful news, and the restrictions should soon be easing. It'll be gradual so that we can protect one another and take care of one another. I've been talking a lot to family during this time that we've been isolated, and I got to thinking about my dad. My dad, I don't know if I ever mentioned that. I know I talked about my mom and dad and how they met during World War II and all this. But my dad was a really whereas my mom was sort of light and bubbly and had a terrific laugh that you'd never forget when you hear it. You'd always recognize her. Dad was a little bit more on the quiet side. But as they say, still waters run deep. And my dad really, truly had great depth, and great warmth, and great feeling. I know I would see it every once in a while. I knew he wrote poetry. Oh, had to know he wrote poetry because, heck, he was published. He was in a book. The book was a collection of poetry, published in 1942. And he wrote it actually shortly after he entered the military. Well, I take that back. Dad had been in ROTC while he was at Cornell. And when he graduated from Cornell in, I believe, 1939, of course, it wasn't that long before Pearl Harbor. And when Pearl Harbor happened, well, he got activated. He told me he knew that was coming, because I remember asking him, Dad, did you go sign up right after Pearl Harbor? He said, I didn't have to. I was already in the Army. I simply had to wait to be called up. And, yeah, I remember that. But Dad had a lot of depth to him. He really did. And he used to recite poetry, but of course I think that came from his family. Dad was one of 9 children. And they lived on a farm in upstate New York, and I know my grandfather, back in that day, recitation was a big deal. So people learned poetry and memorized poetry, and I guess I can tell you that he got it natural because my grandfather used to recite poetry to me, and so did my dad. And then my dad, as I said, wrote poems. I can remember always I would sneak into the living room, and there on the bookshelf would be Sod and Mast. And on page 217, there was a poem that Daddy wrote. It's the only poem I think I ever read in this book. Now that, actually, I didn't have a copy of the book. My sister, we only had one copy, and there were 4 children surviving at the time of my mother's death, so my sister, who got it because she's a poet too. I guess it runs in the blood. It just goes to show you, some things just run in our families, and poetry, to be a writer, was something that both my father and my sister Betsy shared. But so she had the copy. So I was curious. I had been looking for this poem. I thought I might have used it on Memorial Day, because he wrote it when he was in the military. He wrote it shortly after they left for World War II. And I don't know, did I show you the picture of Dad in World War II? Right here. Yeah, I know it's not the greatest picture, but then so many of them weren't. But look at him, young and tall and straight, in front of all those tents. I'm sure many of you were familiar with that kind of scene. Yep, young Lieutenant Grant. Lieutenant George Dexter Grant. Yeah, but he wrote a poem. And apparently when he was young and when he was in the military, when he was in college, when he was young, he wrote a lot of poems. I don't know what happened to all the poems Dad wrote. I think my sister Betsy has some of them. This is the only, I went ahead and found the book on the internet. I was so thrilled because it's pretty much a rare book. And I don't think there's a lot of demand for it, but I found it, I ordered it, and I just got it this week. So I'd like to share my dad's poem with you. As I said, you got to remember when he wrote it. It was probably very early in 1942, just after when he first stood in a camp, probably very similar to the one I showed you. And he wrote this poem, Taps. It goes, we're not afraid to fight and die for the things we think are right. Our homes, our wives, the ones we love, our friends who watched us as we leave, we think of them tonight. 'Twas cold and wet in camp today, but the bugle calls blew softly. No sour notes, no complaint, only strong tones sent aloft. The two has sounded through the tents, and Taps is floating in. We think of those who went before, who slept beneath these stars. They did their best, and so we try to do the same again. As I said, my dad was a very soulful individual. He was very compassionate and very kind. But I think he drifted away when I was young, I suppose, or in my youth, childhood, teenage years. He drifted away from writing so much, I think. I mean, who doesn't sometimes? Life gets busy. Things happen. He worked hard. My dad had several different kinds of jobs when I was young. I think one of the problems was he was good at just about anything he could do, but his interests were broad. And anyway, if he had a fault, that was probably it. But he was very gifted. But I think there were years when it wore him down. He worked long hours. He used to work the evening shift in a factory that made television tubes. And he used to work, and I think for most of my childhood, I just don't remember him being around very much. I have some memories, but not quite as many as I wish. Maybe I was just too busy with myself to take notice. But in high school, I'll tell you that story. I drew closer to my dad as I began to grow up. But I know he didn't write poetry anymore. I'm not sure that he'd changed, that he didn't feel it, he just didn't have time. Or maybe he did. Maybe it all just got dim. The light, the lamp that shows on this wonderful Art Deco style book. The light, the lamp in the darkness. Maybe that light inside, the one that illuminated the poetry he wrote, maybe that one had grown dim. I think it had, because something very important happened when I was in just after I graduated from high school. My sister Betsy's 2 years younger than I was, and she was still in high school. I think I was in my first year of college. And there was a talent show at school. Now, I had shared a room with Betsy all my life. I don't have a lot of pictures of Betsy that aren't on the computer, but I'll show you one. Let's see. I'm trying to. Ugh. You know, I should have had that ready. There we go. Here's my sister Betsy. Actually, she's there with my mom. I imagine Betsy's in her late 30s there. And, but she didn't change that much. I don't think so. But you know how it is when you're close to somebody. You can't see the changes. But I knew Betsy wrote poetry, though she didn't show it to me very often. I shared a room with her, you know, I was her sister. I knew she wrote poetry. Well, Betsy, for the talent, they had a talent show at Betsy's high school. And Betsy chose one of her poems. And she and her friends acted it out while she read it. She had a friend who actually, I think this was her friend's junior year, and her friend, instead of studying in her as she left high school after her junior year, to go to New York because she was studying ballet quite seriously. And that's the friend who danced the poem. And you'll see when I read it to you in just a few minutes. And so Betsy read the poem, and the stage was dark, and there was just a light on her friend who was going to dance the poem. And there were a couple of other friends who stood by as just the bystanders you'll see in the poem. I remember how powerful it was. Of course, after all, take it here, was my sister. But this is the poem that Betsy read, that she had written. It's called Ellendale. Outside she was Sarah and false like them all. If anyone dared look beyond that thin wall, they'd see she was Ellendale, gentle and mild. Ellendale, doe-like, graceful yet wild. She lived in the hope that she'd once have the chance to show the world beauty and joy through her dance. As days passed and years passed, the urging grew great, till Sarah broke down. Ellendale could not wait. She had to be free, like a bird has to fly. She couldn't be Sarah, that was a lie. She went out to the world to do what she must, to show them a beauty untarnished by lust. She stood up before them and gave them a glance, full of love and a smile, and started her dance. She danced of the crispness of autumn's new breeze, and its sound as it rustled its way through the trees. She danced of the night and the dawn that comes after. The people responded. They gave them her laughter. She had to show them. They had to know. She danced of the blizzard and the beauty of snow. Still they laughed. And to show them their blunder, she danced of the storm and the anger of thunder. As she frenzily whirled in a nightmarish dream, "My God, the girl's crazy," she heard someone scream. They jeered her and mocked her from every side. "Lord, won't you help them, forgive them," she cried. Then, wounded by laughter, Ellendale died. I was so proud of Betsy that day, but I wasn't the only one. My mom and Dad were sitting right next to me, and Dad had a tear rolling down his face. This is Dad the way I remember him then. Of course, that's Dad, one of my favorite pictures, he and Mom together. And they're laughing. But so often they did. They were a good couple. It wasn't a perfect marriage, but it was a good one. I can tell you, I didn't see my dad cry. I hadn't at that time seen my dad cry very often. But I knew that his still waters indeed ran deep. And I know that he saw in Betsy and in her poetry the same light and the same energy and the same passion and the same talent that he had felt driving him to write poetry all those years ago. The poetry that he hadn't written now. But Dad was so touched and so moved that the next night, as we sat at dinner, before we started, Dad said, "I have something I want to share." And he congratulated Betsy on winning first place in the poetry in the talent show, the high school talent show. And he said that her poem had really, truly touched him. He said, I come from a long line of poets, and I'm glad to see that it's still alive and that it still runs in the family. And then he read to us a poem he wrote. Probably the first poem he'd written. I don't know. Maybe 15 or 20 years, who knows? Certainly the first poem he'd ever shared with me that he had written with us. And unfortunately, I don't have that poem to read to you. My sister has a copy, but I called her, but unfortunately, it's locked away in a box, in a trunk, with all of her poems, and her copy of Sod and Mass, the book that Dad's poem had written, that Taps was published in. And so she couldn't get it for me. And I don't remember the whole poem, but I do know that at the very end he said, "And to think the light that once burned so brightly in me could glow again in one so young." It was a beautiful poem, and it's a beautiful sentiment. You know, we all have gifts and talents, and so many times we put them on the shelf, and maybe the time has passed. But maybe we've just forgotten. We need especially, I think, to nurture those wonderful and positive and creative parts of ourselves, if we can. Or at least share them with others. My dad died at age 64, far too young. Lung cancer. And I wish I had more than one copy of a poem he wrote. But still I know that Dad's depth and creativity flows in the veins of all his children. With my sister, it indeed took the form of poetry. I don't know how large a dose I got, but still, I'm so proud to be his daughter. Father's Day will be coming up later in June. Maybe I'll share a few more stories about my dad. I really enjoy being able to spend a little time with you each week. Remember, I'm on 9 o'clock on Tuesday and Thursday in the mornings. My worship service airs at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, and then it's shown again at 1 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon, just in case people missed it. And I really look forward to the time when we can be together again. When we can meet at a group. I know there's a poetry group that meets, and for some reason I've never gone. But maybe, just maybe, I need to drop in when we start meeting again. Until next time, God bless you and keep you safe.